I'm really happy to be here and really happy to see all my Chicago hometown folks. Hopefully I'll be back soon. I've been temporarily displaced to Nashville. But I'm really, really happy to be here. And I told Danny we saw each other in May and the weather's just the same, so it's great. Okay, so just to give you an overview of my talk, I'm going to be talking about first the study context, right? So many of you know that I was part of a historic hunger strike in Little Village, just a short bus ride up here from UIC in the Southwest Little Village neighborhood. And so I'm going to share a little bit about the context where the study participants, where they come from, which is based out of my dissertation study. And then I'll kind of hone in on one interview, right? So this is a narrative analysis of one conversation, which is really fascinating. And then I reached out to Josh because I really wanted to understand narrative analysis, right? So one of the reasons I was interested in doing interviews is because I wanted to know what are people's stories, right? What can we learn about, at the end of the day, as a researcher, as a former high school teacher, what do these spaces mean for young people as learners? How do they learn these spaces, and then many years later, what do they take with them, right? So looking at these experiences across time. And then a little bit about what I think the implications are for this particular study. Okay, so it's been 17 years since I was in the hunger strike, and so I'm a little tired of talking about it, quite honestly. So I went on YouTube, and lo and behold, there's somebody else telling the story. So, and it's actually quite appropriate for this particular analysis because the student that I interviewed was really interested in scientific phenomena, like really trying to understand his scientific world and the universe. And so very appropriately, this video also talks about the architecture in the high school, which is often not talked about. So it's a short 6-minute video, but I think you'll enjoy it.
Hi, I'm Joe Duran, and what you just saw was my campus, Little Village Allendale High School. Little Village is composed of 4 different schools: Multicultural Academy of Scholarship, Social Justice, Infinity High School, and World Language. Each school has its own stereotype. World Language is full of a bunch of fresas and paisas. Infinity is full of a bunch of intelligent, cocky people. Social Justice is full of a bunch of rebels that always ditch their school and walk out. And Mont is full of a bunch of people who like to get into fights and just, yeah. So follow me.
Little Village Vanderbilt High School was under construction during 2001. Then during the construction, the contractors said that the budget to build the high school was too low. So they stopped construction.
This is World Language High School. It's blue.
When the parents heard this, many adults showed up to do a hunger strike on May 13, 2001. The hunger strike lasted for 19 days until the school board recontinued construction.
This is Infinity High School. It's purple.
One of the really interesting things about the school is that it's actually made up of a number of small schools. Each small school has its own independent identity, a different color associated with it, and it's a different location on the school's campus.
This is Social Justice. It's red.
when you look at the school, it has a gray glazed tile, so you know that you're in the circulation side, and the academic sides have a tan brick color. So everyone is supposed to have a sense of identity when they're here at the school.
And this is Moss. It's green.
When it was complete, the adults were pleased to have a safe and educational school for their children.
That's it. Those were the 4 schools. We'll be able to learn about the architecture in a little bit, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Ashley Marsh. I'm an architect. I work at Canon Design, and Little Village High School is the school that we designed. The place I'm standing right now is actually a circulation area that connects to areas like the cafeteria and the gymnasiums. To my left, there's a couple schools that are independently in a bar, and to my right, the same thing occurs. You'll also notice that behind me is the cone, as it's commonly referred to, which has become a play and active space for the students. There's a really interesting story about the cone that's in the center of the school. This school was actually formed when mothers in the community had a compassion cry to the Chicago Public Schools that the existing schools were overcrowded. Students didn't have a place to go that was safe and close to home. So they actually went on a hunger strike to convince the Chicago Public Schools that the school was needed in the community. And the cone has a skylight at the top of it that marks the date of the hunger strike every year. So there's a kind of connection to the history of the school. And it's actually got an interesting story also in the way that it was constructed, because even though you can calculate sun angles and you should know where the sun lands, it's actually really tricky to make sure that when you design it, it's actually at that correct angle. So they designed the cone apparatus at the top. So it's a typical skylight, and it has a specialty piece that could be readjusted later if the sun angle wasn't quite correct. The design principal on this project, his name is George Beach, and he was also working on the project with Trung Lee. And Trung Lee is an amazing education architect, and he is well known across the country for his work in influencing better education facilities for students. So this project for me meant quite a lot. The work that I actually do at the firm is really focused on community engagement, nonprofit outreach, and providing design services in communities where access to good design isn't typically the norm. So for me, this project really personifies the way that architecture can really impact the community and provide access and services. So I was really proud. And that's the great thing about architecture too, right? It really catalyzes a community and a series of ideas into a space that thousands of students enjoy and the community can enjoy.
Being part of the community of Little Village and having a Little Village High School, for me, growing up here, I think it's a blessing to be able to come to a beautiful school and something that parents fought for such a long time and finally got it. And to be here knowing that what they accomplished it's great for me, because I know that I'm leading on their legend, and I have to be better for everyone to see that they can be good too.
Yeah. So that was a real joy to find that on YouTube. And I wanted to play it till the end where the student is talking about, right, the significance of it being founded by parents, right, and her thinking that she's also part of that story and part of that legend that she has to carry forward. And so it's also a nice way to introduce the notion of what is story, right, and the impact that stories can have in our lives and in the lives of young people. And so I want to share, so that has been it's going to be the focus of why I'm focusing on just one interview in particular. And of course, if you want to learn more about the struggle, you can just pick up Dave Stovall's book. And he really taught, I think he does a very nice, nuanced, balanced view of kind of like the politics of how it was negotiated over the years. Okay, so with the inaugural class, which started in 2005, Rico Gutstein and I collaborated with the math teachers. So we knew these students from the first day that they walked onto the campus, into Social Justice High School. And we worked with the math teachers on two fronts. One, I have experience teaching IMP, the Interactive Mathematics program, and so I was kind of there to help the teachers figure out how to teach this inquiry-based curriculum. And working with Rico on what it meant to teach math in a school of social justice. So in the first 3 years, kind of interspersing these social justice math projects throughout, right? But IMP was really the main curriculum. In the fourth year, Rico had the opportunity. They thought, well, since we've been working here at the school for 4 years, and Rico has this expertise in critical pedagogy, right? The opportunity arose for him to teach a senior math class where we were able to flip the script. And what I mean by that is that instead of having a reform-based curriculum and dropping in these short units throughout, right, it was the opportunity to use mathematics as a lens to study socio-political issues in the community and affecting their lives, right? So that was the goal of the class, is for them to try to understand how mathematics could be a tool, a weapon in the struggle to understand and affect social change in their worlds. So here, I'm just sharing very briefly a little bit about the class. It was a 12th grade selective class. At Sojo at the time, students had to take, Sojo short for social justice, they had to take 4 years of math. So in the fourth year, they were offered 3 different courses. Math for Social Justice was one of them, and the students elected to go into the class. What's interesting about the student that I'm going to focus on, Calvin, is that he didn't elect to go into the class. He was programmed by mistake. And what's interesting, in our interview, he doesn't remember that part, but I think I'm right. I think from our journals, I think that's actually what happened, right? And so that's why I think partly why his story is so interesting. And so the class itself resembled the demographics of the school racially and ethnically. It was 70% 70% Latinx and 30% African American. But as you can see, a little bit more female than the school was about 50-50, and this class was 70% female, 30% male. So I'm just giving you a sense of how the class went, the curriculum. These were the titles of the different units. They were decided upon the year before. Okay, so Rico met with the students in their junior year after they had selected the class to talk about, well, what do we want to talk about? What do we want to focus on? And then myself and some other graduate students from UIC and also from the University of Wisconsin in Madison worked with Rico over the summer, over the spring semester prior, to start to develop these units. And so, for example, the first one was looking at the 2004 presidential election, and statistically what happened with the battleground states going towards Bush. Was that statistically a reasonable explanation of what happened? And so I think what's important to focus on here is simply the length of the units. In a typical math class, you'll try to cover many, many chapters, right? And here, the units were 11, 13 weeks, right? So it's really an opportunity to really delve into not only the mathematics, but the socio-political aspect of the context. Okay, so again, very briefly, just to give a sense of the pedagogy, because it does come out in the interview with Calvin, the focal student, that one of the things that Rico, so building off Frede's reading and writing the world, right, he appends mathematics. So reading the mathematical word, right, is learning the classical mathematics. Reading the mathematical world is learning to look at the world through a mathematical lens. And that ends up being a critical moment for Calvin and a critical learning for him in the class is what it means to look at the world through a mathematical lens. And then writing the world is working to change it, to actually act upon it. Anita Balasubramanian did her dissertation on the class, and so you can look that up on ProQuest and read more about how she really focused on the interactional features between students and Rico, and how they co-constructed the space. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm really focusing on Calvin, but just to give a sense of my interviewee participants, I interviewed them after they left the school, after they left the class. Because as I was talking to Rico, we had a lot of data. I said to him, I think because of the uniqueness of this experience, I think it's a shame if we don't go back and ask the students what it meant, right? So very broadly, that's what I wanted to do is go and interview them. And of the 21 students, I actually did interview 15, but my data is really only on 13 because I had some issues with audio. But so you can kind of see when I interviewed them, okay? They graduated in 2009. So my first interviews were in the fall of 2011, 2 years after leaving the space, and as far away as 2013, where I was now actually interviewing some college graduates about their experiences, reflecting back, right? So this was a very unique opportunity to try to understand meaning across time. And 2 of the students are actually teachers in Little Village that I wanted to point out. In my dissertation study, so kind of obviously, right, students elect to go into a math class for social justice. What did the class mean for them? Well, they got to learn about social justice, right? They talked about the rigor of the math class, like how difficult the mathematics was, but the fact that they were able to get through it and unpack it was because of the way they worked as a collective, right? The way in which they depended on each other to really help each other through understanding and unpacking the mathematics. The last 3 themes are really focused around issues around social justice. But Calvin, like I said, was a little different. So he was pretty adamant about like, yeah, that social justice stuff, I didn't really pay attention to it. What? It was a school of social justice, right? And so, but he, repeatedly throughout the interview was like, it just didn't, kind of care about it, but not really. It was not a big part of his identity. He had a strong, and I learned this very quickly in the interview, he had a very strong identification with science. Science is what he cared about. And so through the science, we were able to talk a lot about math. And we actually ended the interview actually doing some math, which he quickly, not quickly, but after some time kind of pulled back and raised some important questions. So as I alluded to, I wanted to understand what are the stories, right, that students are telling me. So I didn't go in with a very strict protocol. It was semi-structured because I wanted to kind of see, well, where are the students going to go with our conversation? Which meant that sometimes I didn't get all the data that I wanted, right? But then I got some other really good, rich data, okay? And so building off of, so this is why I turned to narrative analysis, right? Because one of the things that Danny pointed out in my defense proposal was that a lot of my theoretical framing was around critical pedagogy and what does it mean to teach math for social justice. But what I really want to understand is what did it mean for students, right? And so narrative analysis kind of gives me the tools to be able to unpack that a little bit. And so they say, Clennon and Connolly, story is a portal through which a person enters the world and by which their experience of the world is interpreted and made personally meaningful, right? So the idea was that if I could try to understand the stories that they're telling, that would tell me the meaning that they made of this experience many years later, right? What did they take with them across time? Toni Morrison reminds us that narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created, right? So the fact that I'm up here and I'm telling a story of a story, right, is that in the moment, right, I'm creating myself, right? I'm now a researcher, I'm in a research space, right? And what does that mean? And so this quote, the reason I chose it is because it highlights two things, is the fact that not only that, and Wortham talks about this, the difference between a narrated and a narrating event, right? So we tell stories, and that's the narrated event, but as we're telling those stories, there's also a dynamism going on as you tell them, right? And so that's the narrating event, right? So in the interview with Calvin, when initially I looked at the interview, I thought, well, what is he talking about, right? He's talking about these 5 or 6 things. But narrative analysis, when you look at the narrating event, allowed me to then look at how is he telling those things, right? Does it matter that I'm the one that's sitting in front of him, right? Having been a hunger striker, having been in the school for 4 years, you know, in his classrooms, right? And having this particular history with him in the school, does that matter? And I think it does. Clannon and Connolly talk about narrative analysis dealing with three aspects, right? So these, what they call 3 commonplaces, right? Is temporality, right? The time issue. So that was really something that in my dissertation I wasn't able to really capture, that I think I was able to do when I went deeper in with Josh, is how is he talking about the past in relation to the present and in relation to who he wants to be in the future, because that was a big guiding question I had, is not only what did this mean for you, but what does it mean for you going forward? Who is it that you want to be in the world, and how does this experience impact or reflect on that? Sociality is not just about the you know, as he describes his college classes or his high school classes, right? He describes teachers in particular ways. He describes students in particular ways. It also has to do with his feelings and his emotions and his desires as an individual. It also has to do with the interaction between him and I, right? Sitting before me, he's going to tell a different story than he might with other people. Hey, Sasha.
Hi, Dr. Buenrostro.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
And then the other commonplace being place, right? And so as we saw in the video, right, what I think that it captures very well, much better than I think me telling you about the hunger strike, is that you get to see the actual space of the school. What does it feel like to be in there, to be in the cone, to go through the, you know, red, blue, and purple schools? That as he narrates different things, the way that he narrates them, he tells them in certain ways that afford and constrain certain actors, with certain agency, and that kind of thing. So that when we're doing narrative analysis, we kind of want to tend to all 3 things, right? I reached out to Josh, as he mentioned in the in introducing me, about looking at Calvin's story a little bit more deeper. And so the research questions that we kind of set out to understand were, how are the narratives for Calvin of math and science integrated across lifetime phrases? How's he talking about it before he went to social justice, during social justice, in college, and then also thinking forward into his future, which was a big important part of our conversation. As these learning experiences are being narrated, right, how are positions of agency constructed and with what consequences? So one of the things that narrative analysis helped me understand more about my conversation with Calvin was at what places does he have agency, right? Does he have agency in the stories of the past? Does he have agency of stories in the future? Is one of the things that we kind of set out to understand. Okay, so a little bit about our methods, the way we went about it, was that, so you can see, these are some of the en vivo phrases that came out of analyzing the transcript. Orbits and planets, he was really interested in astronomy, right? So that was one of the bounded events, narrated events. So we broke up the transcript into 47. We first did it separately. We had about 42. We decided, we negotiated. Some seemed a little bit more packed and needed to be unpacked a little bit more, or separated out. So we ended up with 47 events. And so this wordy or wordle or something kind of gives you a sense of some of the events. And they were in vivo phrases from the actual interview. So on the left side, I share two of them just to give you guys a sense of the temporal, how did we separate these events out, right? Was essentially by topic, right? Like, what are we really talking about here? So here's two examples. They Didn't Care at Hawthorne is really him describing the general space of this community college where teachers didn't care, versus Math on the Computer at Hawthorne is a more specific place, right? So it will shift in temporality and place from one event to the other. So then Josh and I kind of took these events and we analyzed them separately along these lines of temporality, place, sociality, and also agency, because that was one of our research questions. And we came up with 4 temporal frames. So the first one is Calvin's evolving relationship to science. As I mentioned very early on, I realized that he really likes science. It's really important to him. So he kind of narrates these across time spaces, right? High school, the future. And then the last 3 are really temporal frames in the sense of they took place in a particular time. High school, college, and then the future. Okay, so I'm going to go through the frames. And so I think, I'll just point out what I want us to pay attention to. But the first one is, this was like the second event, right? If there's 40 events in the transcript, this was like the second or third one. He's telling me about Mr. Dario's chemistry class. And he says, it was really good. It was fun to be in that class. He didn't make it boring and just throwing facts at you. He tried to connect it with the world. He always played music in the beginning of classes that related to science in a way or social justice. So it was pretty good. That's the one that stood out for me, right? Because my first question was, well, tell me something that stood out from high school. And so this is what he shares, right? And this is someone who says later on repeatedly, like, I didn't really care about the social justice, but yet this is the one science, critical pedagogical science class that is really standing out for him. But it's not just that class. That class kind of introduced him to his love for science, right? He starts to like it then. But then he also narrates his own agency in watching documentaries. He shared with me this experience of going through 2 biology textbooks on his own. He's like, I went from front to cover. I went through every single chapter and every exercise, right? Who does that? Calvin. Yeah. And so he watches these documentaries. He's really interested in the planets and orbits, right? He talks about, he says, one of these documentaries, they mentioned this inverse square law. He's like, I really want to know what that is, right? So he's interested in the math when it's through this particular scientific lens. So that was frame 1, is really about his relationship to science across different time frames. So then we talk about math and science at Sojo. He describes IMP as it did connect to the world. So connect starts to become this term that we use and we rely on as we talk in the interview, right? So IMP, it did connect to the world, and then he shares with me a particular lesson in IMP 4. So 90 seniors, Calvin was the only senior who was enrolled in 2 math classes, right? One by mistake, and then IMP 4. And so he tells me this thing of the Ferris wheel, having been an IMP teacher. I know exactly what he's talking about. I'm like, yes, the one about trig. And he's like, yeah, the one about physics, right? So I'm like foregrounding the mathematics because I'm a math educator and this is why I'm doing the interview. And he's pulling me to the science, right? So I asked, what did you like about it? The whole physics thing. And so I say the fact that it was related to something you could imagine, right? Because I'm picking up on this characteristic that he really likes about learning, and he says you can see, yeah. So we start to use these words of connecting and imagining and seeing throughout the interview. So then we go to the math for social justice class. And I thought this is probably the main reason why I wanted to go more in depth with this interview, is because he says, I asked him, right before this, I asked him, did you learn math? And he says, I felt like I was less scared of math, right? Not that I learned more math, just less scared of putting it to use. You know, looking at the world through, like they said, those social justice people, like looking at the world through mathematics. I thought that was really important. That's what it taught me. So this is his big takeaway, right? Is the fact that through his science identity, through his scientific lens of looking at the world, he can feel less intimidated of putting math to use, right? I think those choice of words are very interesting. So he keeps telling me, this class, this math for social justice class, was hard. It was hard but easier, hard but easier. And it takes him to say it a few times before I pick up on it, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, so that's interesting. Even though it was harder, you were like less scared. Yeah, because IMP did connect it to the world, but it wasn't I didn't feel it was connected to things happening right there and then, such as the election, and you said, and the housing. So I feel like, and I say they're real life, but not real to your life. Then these things are real to our lives, right? So I've started thinking about, when we hear a lot about, real world context, right? But as Rico and I have shared, about different experiences, kids don't really know what kayaking is. That's not really real to their world, right? But, the housing crisis, not being, what's affordable? Can my parents afford to pay the rent or buy a house? Like, that's real to their lives. And so then I say, so that made a difference in making it easier, because to me as a math educator, right, math is hard, it creates anxiety in people, right? That's like the master narrative around mathematics. But he's saying it was difficult, but then it also was easier, okay? Making it harder and easier, because I mean harder because it was hard math, but easier because it was easier to relate to. So that experience helped you feel less intimidated? Yeah. By the math? Yeah, because I mean, I think if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be so interested in science as well, because I mean, the problems, orbits and planets, I'm really interested in that, yet I have no idea how to do it, but I would like to learn, right? So to me, how I view this is his experience in learning very difficult math that was situated and real to his life context created an opening for him to think about, maybe I could learn about the inverse square law, right? If it's situated in a context that I really care about, right? Maybe, so he starts to, it's like an opening to having some agency in his own learning of mathematics. And so he attributes that experience to then actually liking more science. College, but then he went to college, right? And so you can only imagine what happened in those math classes, right? No offense to math college professors in the room. But, so he describes, what's interesting about all of the way he narrates, almost without exception, every single one of his classes is he tells me something about the class and he says something about the teacher. It was a good class, the teacher was nice. That was a hard class, the teacher was judgy, right? So to him, how he sits in these spaces has a lot to do with how students and teachers relate to one another. And so he talks about transitioning from IMP to college math, because it's hard to transition from IMP to regular math, because then I like IMP because of the whole model thing that we talked about, and colleges just go back straight to math. There's no imagining. There's no application. There's nothing. It's just math. And that can get pretty boring, right? So we're throughout the interview constructing this idea that for him, learning is important if it's something he can imagine. And oftentimes math is not something he can imagine. His future goals is he wants to learn calculus and physics. He has saved 5 trig notebooks, right? He's like, I have these 5 trig notebooks from the class I failed and then the class I passed, right? But he says things like, I have to get these things in my head. I'll be able to memorize that math more. If I were really smart and I knew everything, I would like to work in Fermilab. As a reform math educator, I'm really alarmed by these comments. Like getting things in your head, right? It's kind of reminiscent of like the brain as an empty vessel that things need to be poured in, right? So he does go on to say that he wants to go for his doctorate, but it feels very fantastical, right? Very like, it's a vision, it's a dream, right? That doesn't feel very something that he can necessarily apprehend. And he says, I think I could do the science fine, it's just the math, right? So this math thing is really problematic. So because he's saying these things, I'm like, well, hey, let's do some math, right? Because I really want to, that's my place in this interview largely is, I'm a teacher educator, I want to help him through the math. So we start to do some trig. The interviews takes place in my kitchen. And so he says, after we have several turns of doing trig, he says, but I don't understand, how does that, the unit circle, relate to at all to anything? And I'm like, to anything, right? He's like, yeah, what's the point of trig? That's a good question. I don't know if I could answer it, right? So me, along with many, I place myself in this community of math teachers that we learn mathematics in a particular way, and there's a lot of questions that sometimes students have, like, why do I have to learn this, right? That oftentimes we don't know how to answer, right? This is one of those situations. And he says, I don't understand that. It's like we're doing it, but I don't understand why are we doing it. What's the point? What does the circle have to do with anything? The way that Calvin is a learner, he's trying to literally in his schema place it somewhere, and he can't, right? And apparently I can't either because I can't help him. So, very fascinating story. And so if we go back to the research questions, right? How are narrations of math and science learning integrated across the time frames? So as I mentioned, right, this idea of connecting, and seeing and imagining was something that got woven throughout. And that's really a co-construction of, I believe it's a co-construction between Calvin and I, right? It happened in this particular time and space in this particular way, and we were able to draw together on these notions of imagining and connecting and relating. He really talks about, as I mentioned, the teacher-student relationality, which is a big part was a big part of my dissertation, and the work that I'm interested in moving forward, right, is what are the types of relationships that students and teachers are having, and what does that have to do with learning, right? I think it has to do a lot with learning. As the experiences are narrated, right, how does he position himself? How do I position himself? How do we position each other? Right? In his stories, at times he has agency, at times he doesn't have agency. But what's interesting in the narrating event is that I keep wanting to talk about the math, he keeps wanting to talk about the science, right? So we have this tug, this tug and pull going back and forth. What are the implications? Hopefully you guys have lots of ideas of what some of the implications might be. But for me, I think and this is connected to Calvin's story, but also other stories in the interviews that I had, is the idea that it wasn't until they took this year-long Math for Social Justice class that students made real connections, right? They made connections in this class that they didn't make just learning about math for social justice the first 2 weeks of freshman year, maybe sometime the end of the first semester, then the sophomore year, then the junior year. They really were interspersed throughout, but it wasn't until this year-long class that they made some really deep and profound connections, right? And so the one that Calvin is making is that it can be less scary if it's actually situated in something that he cares about and something that he can imagine. And so many of the students I interviewed, right, connected to the social justice. They chose the class, and it really drew and built on their sense of social justice. But for Calvin, right, there's a different story here, and so that partially what I'm arguing is the fact that we just need to understand how students are experiencing these spaces, right? What is the meaning that they're taking from it, in the present, in the future? And then the last thing I'll say is that, so when most of the students, I reach out to them through Facebook, right? And Calvin reaches out to me, right, through Facebook, through Messenger, and he's like being very casual about, how I'm doing. What's up, gangsta, That's kind of Calvin, how he talks, jokingly, right? And then I'm like, hey, I want to interview you about math. And then they just cut off the communication for years. He didn't literally respond back to me for almost a year and a half. He was like, well, what are you going to interview me about? I'm like, not about math equations. Like, I don't want to know about math. I just want to know about your experience. But the minute I introduce math, it's like really high stakes for him. He's like, whoa, this is not fun anymore, right? And so, also in the narrative, as we're doing the trig, right? We're like, I'm as a teacher being like, look, this is how it makes sense. See, like very, at a very micro level, right? It's the unit circle, it's the ratios of sides, it's the tangents, and he steps back and he's like, what's the point? He literally like gestures back and says, I just don't understand this stuff. And so at the moment, it just feels, a little overwhelming, but really like high stakes in the sense of like he has this dream and this vision of working at Fermilab, but the mathematics is really holding him back.